Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the beginning of the winter lecture series. It is focused this winter on Gilded Age architecture, and our speaker tonight is going to start us off beautifully. If you are interested in learning more about the lectures that are being offered this winter, please go to our website, go to the Learn tab, and look under Adult Programs, and you will see an array of great lectures ahead. Our next lecture is on February 11th at 5:30. And I am going to be giving a speech about Horace Trumbauer. And I just learned a little bit about him from Sam White, so I will add that into my speech. And I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We had a tremendous reaction to this lecture. Thank you, Sam, so much. And we hope that if you like these free lectures, you will consider, if you're not, becoming a member of the Preservation Society or being involved with us in one way or another. The person who is going to handle the question and answer period is our fellow, Sebastian Dutton. Sebastian, as many of you know, you've heard him speak, is doing research on the third floor of the breakers. He knows a lot about Vanderbilt buildings. He studied very carefully Elm Court, which is in the Berkshires. We are very much looking forward to hearing his research when he's finished. Sebastian is going to be handling the questions. So if you have a question along the line, you just write it into the question and answer box, and he will do his best to make sure that all of the questions are answered. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we were very lucky to recently focus on a gift that is on loan to us from Guy and Mary Van Pelt. It is a vest that was Mrs. Stanford White's, and the Van Pelts are promising to give us it in the future. I wanted to give them a public thank you because that's a special piece of a collection that we are very pleased. And it was found in Elm Court, which is the Van Pelt house here in Newport, in the attic. Nobody quite knows how it got there. It might have come from a party that was being held at that house. So it's a nice part of our collection. And now it is my great honor to introduce Sam White, who has many accomplishments to his name. Sam is the great grandson of architect Stanford White. He is the founder and consulting partner of PBDW, which is a New York firm, which has done incredible interventions in a number of historic buildings, restorations of the Park Avenue Armory, beautiful job, the Palace Theater, Astor Court, reconfiguration of New York Historical Society and other landmarks in American architecture. Really great work. He also does modern work. He recently completed a net zero energy dormitory for Williams College. So bravo to you, Sam. And on top of being an architect, he has written a number of books, including The Houses of McKim, Mead, and White, Nice House, and Stanford White in Detail. And I am not sure that things are showing on the screen. I hope that, Sam, you will hold the book up so that people can see it. It is his latest book. It is absolutely gorgeous. He has co-authored with his wife, Elizabeth, McKim, Mead, and White, The Masterworks, and Stanford White Architect. He is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He is an academician of the National Academy of Design. He is a trustee of Greenwood Cemetery and the St. Gaudens Memorial. And he's got so many things under his belt. He is a member of the advisory board of the New York Landmarks Conservancy and a former adjunct associate professor of fine arts at New York University. Sam is a graduate of Harvard and of the University of Pennsylvania. And Sam, I cannot tell you how delighted we are to have you here tonight as our guest and kicking off the winter lecture series. So thank you, Sam White.
Well, Trudy, thank you very, very much for that introduction. Let's see if we can get me onto the screen. I'm not quite sure what I have to do.
It looks like you are on the screen.
Well, how good is that? Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And Trudy, thank you so much for that introduction. The book that Trudy mentioned is here. It's called Stanford White in Detail. Sometimes you can hold it right side up. And the other thing about it is that it's a book that you can actually hold up with one hand, unlike the other books that Elizabeth and I have written about McKim, Mead, and White. This book is different in that it keeps a very tight focus on the ornamental details that animate and enrich Stanford White's work, and they are really beautiful. They are amazing. And so the book itself, which has very little text and is mostly just wonderful photographs, is like a box of chocolates with no calories. So highly recommended, but it's different. Tonight, what I'm going to talk about instead is I'm going to turn the telescope around and talk about the themes that connect Stanford White's work across the span of his career. Those themes include his collaborations with other artists and architects, the interesting way in which he used ornament, or even unique, which is the subject of the book, but most particularly the source of inspiration for his remarkable designs. At Stanford White, those designs, I am convinced, have arose from a synthesis of two factors, his memory and his imagination. Now, we all have memory and imagination to some extent, but in Stanford White's case, the cocktail was like rocket fuel. And he was able to take historic precedent and reinterpret it in ways that were authentically original, but at the same time, reassuringly familiar. His skill at doing that and the success that he achieved makes him what I think is one of the most important architects in the history of American design. Well, the facts of Stanford White's life are pretty straightforward, and I'm going to switch screens right here. Let's see, there we are. He was born in 1853 in New York. He was murdered in 1906. At the age of 19, and really with the help of his father, he got a job as a apprentice to Henry Hobson Richardson, who was the most important architect in America. And he stayed with Richardson for 6 years, rising to become Richardson's principal assistant, and then leaving for a 14-month sabbatical in Europe, after which he returned in 1879 to New York to go into partnership with Charles McKim and William Rutherford Mead. With their combination of compatible personalities and complementary but different artistic temperaments was an instant success. And over the next 25 years, McKim, Mead, and White grew from a small atelier of 12 architects to become the largest and most famous architecture firm in the country, if not in the world. Well, Stanford White was born with his imagination, but he let's just see if we can get this thing going. You're going to forgive me for 1 second. There we are. He started sort of accumulating a store of memories while he was still working for Richardson. I mean, in the mid 1870s, with his friends Charles McKim and William Mead, they weren't yet partners, they were just acquaintances in New York, went on what they later referred to as their celebrated New England walking tour, a trip up to Salem, Massachusetts and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to take a look at examples of late colonial and early federal period architecture, such as this building here in Portsmouth. And White noted the proportions of the building, the restrained use of materials and colors, but he was particularly taken with the front door. The front doors of federal period houses are wonderful. They not only are richly paneled, but they are surrounded with side lights and transoms that have small pieces of glass set in lead in a highly ornamental fashion. And 25 years after White takes this trip, he pulls up that doorway in a house in Southampton that he did for Jimmy Breeze. This is called the Orchard, and the house is a Palladian plan consisting of pavilions that are connected by hyphens, and you pass through a hyphen to go from one pavilion to the other. Here you're going from the main block into the music room, and to reinforce the sense of passage and procession, and to give that passage a little bit of an outdoor feel, the hyphen here is designed with a tile floor. It's got lattice on the walls, and then it has essentially a front door. He also, that same period, 25 years after the trip, designed what must have been one of the first federal revival houses in New York City. This is the house for Charles Dana Gibson at 73rd Street and Lexington Avenue. And again, the restrained use of materials, and that wonderful front door. Well, when White went on his sabbatical in Europe, he filled dozens of sketchbooks. He spent most of his time in northwestern France. And here is a building called the Château de Plessis-Marseille, which is near Anjou. And White was particularly taken by the kind of the medieval picturesqueness of this composition with its sort of staccato, opportunistic roof line, the arch over the doorway, and then that richly textured projecting bay on the left. In this case, White did not have to wait 25 years to pull this one up. He waited about a year, and it is the basis for the interior court elevation of the Newport Casino, which will be familiar to all of you in Newport. Same sort of staccato roofline, the same arch, and the same richly textured spandrel. That had a short shelf life, that particular idea. Well, the trip to Europe, which was 14 months, started with a 1-month trip down the Rhone to look at examples of Romanesque architecture. And he took that 1-month trip with his friends Charles McKim and William Rutherford Mead. And at the end of the trip, Mead made this little medal to commemorate what was a trip with a serious architectural purpose, but filled with a lot of hijinks, which were all carefully recorded in letters to Stanford White's mother. You see McKim with his tall forehead on the right. You see St. Gaudens with his pointed beard. And then you see Stanford White at the top looking as if he stepped on some third rail, which is probably how he looked most of the time. In the upper right corner, you see a little elevation of a church, and that is the Cathedral of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in a town just north of Avignon. After White saw this, he wrote in one of those letters to his mother that this was the finest piece of architecture in all of France. Well, Stanford White was given to these uncritical superlatives, but it is a terrific piece of architecture. And once again, it sort of fermented in his brain for 25 years. And then White got a commission from Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt to design memorial doors for her husband for St. Bartholomew's Church, which was then at 47th Street and Madison Avenue in a building designed by James Renwick. And so White recreates the facade entrance of the Cathedral of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard, and he adds it to Renwick's church. Well, 20 years later, the congregation moved from 47th and Madison up to 51st and Park in a building that was designed by Bertrand Goodhue. But they were so fond of White's entrance doors that they insisted that Bertrand Goodhue accommodate them in his design for the new church. And you have to believe that Goodhue had mixed feelings about this because it's a difficult form to incorporate into Goodhue's church. But nonetheless, it is a fabulous piece of street furniture, and we are lucky that the congregation made their stand. White was visiting with St. Gaudens on that trip to Europe because St. Gaudens was in Paris working on his statue of David Glasgow Farragut, the great naval hero of the Battle of Mobile Bay and Civil War, the damn the torpedoes full speed ahead guy. And this was the commission that really established St. Gaudens as the great sculptor of the 19th century. It was his first great public commission. But it was a collaboration because St. Gaudens would do the statue and Stanford White would do the base. Well, the statue really changed the course of American sculpture. I mean, here, St. Gaudens is representing a naval war hero in contemporary naval dress rather than a Roman toga, which was pretty much the spirit up to that time. But it also captures a psychological moment. Farragut has just seen something on the horizon, and he's just tensed his left arm to reach for his binoculars. It really is a very special thing if you know what to look for in this piece of sculpture. Well, it may have changed the course of American sculpture, but Stanford White's design for the base did not change the course of the design of bases in American sculpture because nobody has ever tried to do something like this again. White sees the base as an opportunity to swing for the fences, filling it with wonderful with text, with images, and then creating this curved bench called an exedra, which is inviting you to come and sit at the feet of the naval war hero. I mean, White really believed that his designs needed to engage the observer, and if it was the base for a statue, that's where he was going to do it. If you want to see the sort of the difference between Stanford White and Charles McKim, look at these two pieces in New York, the Farragut down in Madison Square, and then the Sherman statue up at the Grand Army Plaza on 59th Street. The base for the Sherman was done by McKim. And here you can see, St. Gaudens did both sculptures, but here you see McKim really keeping his eyes on the road. I mean, his job was to make that statue have presence within the open space and not to get in the way of St. Gaudens. And he does this by sort of the transition from the vertical of the sculpture to the horizontal of the ground plane is accomplished with a series of just perfectly proportioned classical details. It's really a very, very beautiful piece of background architecture. Stanford White was not going to be in the background, as you can see. He really wanted to be an equal player. Well, they were equal players, and they both signed, Stanford White and St. Gaudens signed their work on the back of this crab, which is set in the pebble dash at the base of the Farragut statue. And here you can see sort of the first sign of Stanford White's sort of taste for the picturesque characteristics of slightly bizarre animals. This is another sort of slightly bizarre thing, an abstracted spider's web, which is in a balcony at the 7th Regiment Armory. This is in what's called the library or silver room. This is a room that is pretty much a design by Stanford White, and that has many things that White would then use throughout the early portion of his career, that coved ceiling with the cast plaster lattice, the fireplace, the ironwork on the chandelier. White was pretty much responsible for this, but the overall commission was a collaboration with a group called the Associated Artists, a group led by Louis Comfort Tiffany, who's in the lower left. It had Lockwood DeForest, who's in the upper left, looking like he's going to a costume party. It had Candace Wheeler in the lower right. She was responsible for the designing of the fabrics, the portieres. And then it had Samuel Coleman as the colorist. Coleman was the painter. McKim, Mead, and White did a house for him on Red Cross Avenue, which is still there today. And they were professional interior decorators. They were a business. They did a room in the White House. They did the Havemeyer House in New York. They did the interiors for the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut. Those are still, that one is still there. But for one commission, they were joined by the very young Stanford White, and that was for the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, a room that my firm had the good fortune to participate in the restoration of recently, a room in which it is impossible to tell who was responsible for what. I mean, we'll give Tiffany the stained glass windows, but after that, I think it's anybody's guess. But it's also a room that really defines the concept of visual overload. It is, at the end of the day, the most, if not one of the most important aesthetic period rooms in America. Well, when White was with Richardson, the lessons of the Beaux-Arts, where Richardson had gone, were that it was the architect's job to be the leader of a group of artists in these commissions. And an example of White as leader is seen in the Church of the Ascension, which is in New York City on 5th Avenue and 10th Street. Here, the team consisted not only of White, but of John Lafarge in the lower right, who was responsible for the mural of the Rising Christ. It had Louis St. Gaudens, the upper right, who was the brother of Augustus. And then it had Maitland Armstrong in the lower left, who did the mosaics. Well, this was an interesting job. This church had been designed in the mid-19th century by Upjohn, whose instructions from the congregation, and this was a low church congregation, were to create a church in which it would never be possible to have a chancel, because chancels were the setting for all kinds of popish doings that they didn't want to have anything to do with. And so, the church is designed with this relatively short nave, and then the rectory is backed up right against the back of the nave, so you could never expand it. 40 years later, the congregation had moved theologically to one left or right, you decide, and decided that they really did want a chancel. And they asked White to design one where Upjohn had made pretty darn sure that none could be built. White did it by taking over the last bay in the nave and then using generous amounts of gold, a great mural by John Lafarge, and these wonderful mosaics and bas-reliefs. It has this great giant overscaled bird, which peacock, which shows White's sort of continued taste in the picturesque characteristics of slightly bizarre animals. Well, the most important collaborations that White did in his career were those with Charles McKim, who's on the right, and William Rutherford Mead, who is standing. And when they started off, McKim, Mead, and White was a small office in a relatively small space, and it was maybe, I don't know, 300, 400, possibly 500 square feet. But drafting boards are big, and what the work of the early firm shows is the unintended consequences of having two very strong designers in one very small drafting room, that there is this real struggle for participation and contribution. And an example of that is the Samuel Tilton House in Newport on Sunnyside Place. I mean, here you look at the great gable roof that organizes the whole composition. You look at the strongly asymmetrical two-story bay on the left, and then the organization of the windows and panels into continuous horizontals. That is 100% Charles McKim. McKim is in charge of this elevation. But as you move around the house, you see Stanford White sort of clawing his way back into the game. Here's the west elevation, which has a real mix of materials. And it has the, on the right, the panel, sgraffito panel in a urn shape. And that consists of rocks and pieces of broken glass stuck into wet cement. This is something that White saw in northwestern France. This is a medieval element. Also, the half timbering is another medieval element that he saw, in this case, filled with pebble dash rather than stucco. There is one of his windows with those tiny little panes of glass divided by lead, I mean, just real texture. And as you move around to the north elevation, Stanford White is completely in control with the half timbering, the pebble dash infill, the windows with leaded canes, and then that extraordinary sgraffito panel. Stanford White must have gotten up onto the scaffold to do this, because you could never communicate something like this with a drawing or verbally. And so I think here you were looking at Stanford White's signature on this elevation. Well, when you get to the inside of that house, it's not so much a competition for participation as a clear assignment of roles. McKim was in charge of the plan. He and Richardson had developed something called the living hall plan, in which a room becomes the kind of spiritual and physical and operational center of the house, with a staircase, a fireplace, banquettes. It's near the door, and all the rooms come off at like a pinwheel in a sense. So McKim did the plan, but McKim and Mead had invited Stanford White to join their partnership because they knew that they could not do interiors at a very high level. And they thought that Stanford White might be able to. And here, as in King's Coat around the corner, Stanford White shows that they picked the right man. Well, Stanford White could also collaborate vertically within the organization. This is a picture of an architect named Joseph Morrill Wells. And it's probably about the only picture you're ever going to see of Wells. He was not one for the camera. Wells was an exact contemporary of Stanford White. Born in 1853. Like Stanford White, he finished high school, but was never received any academic training. He learned to be an architect through various apprenticeships. And he was the first employee hired by McKim, Mead, White in 1879 when they opened their door. He became the principal designer in the drafting room. He and Stanford White bonded tremendously, and they just did amazing things together. Wells was so good that he was offered a partnership eventually in the firm, which he rejected, saying that he would never put his name on so much damn bad work. So a prickly son of a gun, to be sure, but anybody who runs an office knows that somebody like that is very, very valuable. His greatest contribution, I think, the one in which his name is most clearly connected, is the Villard houses on 51st Street and Madison Avenue. The story was that Stanford White got the commission and then did the basic plan in which 5 separate townhouses are arranged to appear to be a single grand urban palazzo. And then Stanford White left for New Mexico to go join his brother, Richard, for a short time, leaving Wells in charge of developing the elevations. And while up to that point, the firm had been doing their urban facades really in a sort of a Richardsonian, Romanesque manner, Wells thought that it was time to grow up, and that the elevations of the Villard houses are based on the details of the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome. And this was considered to be such a success that I think you have to give Wells a large amount of credit for turning McKim, Mead, and White from their sort of Richardsonian days into the architects of the American Renaissance that they became. Well, White did return from New Mexico and got into the interiors, which he did with Wells. Here is a design by Stanford White showing his imagination is firing on all 12 cylinders. This is a zodiac clock. The bas-relief figures of the zodiac were carved by Augustus St. Gaudens, and this is on the stairway. It's an extraordinary design. I've never seen anything like it. The whole interior, White and Wells did sort of topping each other for imaginative ideas, all for a client who seemed to have bottomless pockets and an unwillingness to say no. Here's the stair hall, which is covered with sienna marble, very expensive. The stained glass windows in the background are by Maitland Armstrong. The balusters look like sort of embroidery turned into marble. Then that wonderful column capital with the upturned volutes and the rosette, which is in the shape of a wagon wheel. Remember that Villard's fortune came from railroads. So here was, this was an example of how what you get when you let 2 really good guys loose, and they're on the same track. Well, sadly, Wells died early. He died in 1890, 11 years after he had joined the firm, and he is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Medford, Massachusetts, with this stone, which was designed by Stanford White and carved by Augustus St. Gaudens. A couple of years ago, a man named John McConnell pointed out to us that the stone was broken and lying in the mud. And so a group of us got together and raised an amount of money to restore and re-erect the stone, which, as you see it now today, there's one more step, which is to surround the stone with a base of white marble, which is, and then a little bit of landscaping, which has been designed by a landscape architect named J. Olmsted, who is the step-great-grandson of Frederick Law Olmsted. So this is really, the restoration of this is much of a home team performance as its original creation. It's worth a visit just to see, and I'd say an important footnote in the history of the American Renaissance. Well, Stanford White could, as they say in baseball, play all positions. I mean, he and Wells were a great combination, but Stanford White had ideas of his own. And an example of those can be seen in this house in a place called Cornwall, Pennsylvania, which is near Lancaster. Cornwall, there could not have been direct train connections to Cornwall in the late 19th century. And so it must have taken sort of 4 or 5 or 6 hours to get there with various transfers. And the commission came in, and as Stanford White was the junior partner, he probably drew the short straw and was sent out to take a look at the site, which he did, looked at the site, and then got back in the train for the 4 or 5 or 6 hour trip back into New York. And I'm convinced that in the course of that trip, Stanford White designed this house, because this shows everything that Stanford White is interested in and nothing so much of what McKim is interested in. I mean, starting with the massing, which is much more complex than McKim would have allowed. Then you have that projecting porte cochere with its sort of slightly schlumpy medieval quality. It's half timbering, I should call it picturesque medieval quality, half timbering with, in this case, pink stucco infill. These are things that Stanford White had seen on his trip to the northwestern corners of France. The arch over the window to the stairway, the lattice, we've seen those before. And then the whole house is covered with painted clapboard rather than, or painted shingles, rather than raw shingles, as we have seen in the Tilton house. Stanford White signed this house everywhere he could. You have these sgraffito panels on the soffits, on the eaves, on the walls, everywhere he could. You have a wonderful sort of example of Stanford White saying that he was there, and it enriches the house. My favorite detail on the exterior of this house is the two-story bay that rises to become a porch with that wonderful candle snuffer roof with a highly picturesque flashing detail, and then all topped with a sort of explosion of wire. Uh, the best part of the porch with those two groaning columns. I mean, when you look at this, you feel the weight of the roof. And this is Stanford White's architecture of empathy. He is engaging the observer in the reading of his architecture. And so in the case of Stanford White, it really takes two to make architecture. I mean, it takes Stanford White and his building and the observer. Inside, you have memory and imagination sort of competing with each other. The ceiling of the entry hall is based on a plate from a book called The Elements of Arab Art that was published in Paris in 1850. Those lanterns look like they were taken out of the Casbah somewhere. And then that screen at the bottom of the stairs that you see, that's called a mashrabia. It's a device from Arab countries that was used to give you privacy and ventilation. What Stanford White liked about it was that it sort of fit his paradigm of very fine detail that would be initially revealed by light and then dissolved by light. And that's what happens here. As for imagination, you have the Stanford White sort of incredible vocabulary of what he can do with ordinary wood. This room shows White's interest in creating a kind of an engine for his architecture that moves you through his architecture based on compression and release, a kind of cycle that's very much like the cycle of an internal combustion engine. And here is an example of compression, and it's compression in two respects. It's physically a small space, but visually, I mean, all these things are going on. You are sort of assaulted in the most pleasant way and all from all sides. You are in the compression mode right here, but when you go through that arch, this is what you come into, the 2.5-story or 3-story living room, which is release. I mean, all of the details here are treated much more with much more restraint. The half timbering is flush with the plaster. There's no pebble dash here. They're just gold stars that have been stenciled onto the plaster. That fireplace is a very domesticated version of a medieval fireplace. And then the end wall is 14 of those square stained glass panels. It's really an extraordinary room, but the two of them work together as this kind of yin and yang. Imagination sort of claws its way back to the top here in the dining room, where the ceiling has fishnet that has been glued to the plaster. The upper walls are cane set in panels. The lower walls are marquetry blocks, some end grain of wood. And then that sideboard, if you look at these corners of the sideboard and the back of it, it's clearly a built-in piece of furniture. But then you look at the legs and it suggests that it's actually freestanding. And this is what I call the estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. This is where Stanford White liked to sort of touch every once in a while, and he liked to exploit the ambiguity that it created. There's one painted room in the house. This is a sitting room, and here White is starting to use, this is an early house again, he's starting to use what would be his favorite color scheme of ivory paint with gold leaf. And he's also exploring different profiles for moldings rather than the sort of the classical Vitruvian moldings that McKim was so fond of. And then you look at the frame around the mirror with those little staccato beads with gold on them. That's very much like some of the frames that Stanford White designed. He was the great frame designer of the late 19th century. His frames are still around. They're actually still reproduced. They're fiercely expensive, but you can see them in museums, the original ones, in surrounding paintings by Chase or by Dewing, and you can recognize them from 2 galleries away. They're really stunning pieces. Here's a frame that White designed in a more Renaissance vocabulary. This encloses a bas-relief by Augustus St. Gaudens, which shows Bessie Springs Smith on the occasion of her wedding to Stanford White on February 1884. This was a wedding present to the Whites from St. Gaudens. And they went off after this wedding and waited a month or two. And then in the spring, they went off to the Mediterranean, where they spent about 3 months traveling around, going as far west as Spain, maybe as far east, certainly as Constantinople. That's where this wonderful picture of Stanford White was taken, showing a young architect in a very sort of trustworthy appearance. And they may have gone to Africa, I'm not sure, but they spent most of their time in Italy, going up and down the peninsula, Venice, Florence, Rome. And I think that it was in Italy and on this honeymoon that Stanford White really did sort of come to the conclusion that Wells had come to before, which was that the best way to make New York City attractive was with an architecture based on the designs of the Italian Renaissance. And so he took possibly this church or a church like it. This is the Santa Maria in Cosmedin, the church in Rome where you would take your 12-year-old to stick his or her hand in the lion's mouth. I mean, it's a real tourist trap, and you can see the crowd waiting to do it. But he took the tower from this church and he plunked it on top of the Judson Memorial, which is just south of Washington Square. And it must have been a sort of an improbable thing in the skyline of New York. I mean, up to that point, New York was a brownstone town, and you look at this and you think, what is going on? And then he took the entrance to the church. I mean, you look at the entrance to Santa Maria, and it's pretty plain stuff. And he put as his entrance this piece of Renaissance eye candy to beat the band. Just the most extraordinary thing that sort of picks up the whole experience of walking along 4th Street. It's framed by those sort of deeply rusticated terracotta bands. This is Stanford White's gift to that part of the city, and this is something that he did. My favorite of these memory imagination combines are these two buildings. The building on the left is in Verona. It's called the Loggia del Consigli, the porch of the lawyers. The building on the right, you know, is on St. Mark's Square. It's the Torre Orologio, the clock tower. And he takes these two buildings and he sort of inhales them. And then what he exhales is this, the building for the New York Herald newspaper, owned by James Gordon Bennett, who had been the firm's client for the Newport Casino. This building contained an entire newspaper operation. It had the editorial and business offices, the typesetting, the printing plant was in the basement. You could see the newspaper being printed by stepping into that arcade and on the left and looking through huge plate glass windows. This was a real piece of this is a building that gave back to the street in New York in every respect. It's the building that I most regret no longer exists in New York of their designs. And it is the building that Charles McKim described as the finest piece of architecture produced by their firm. Well, as I say, on the honeymoon, he may have gone as far west as Spain. Even if he didn't, he knew this building. This is the called the Giralda. It's at the cathedral in Seville. This is the tower. And this started off as a minaret in a mosque when the Moors were in residence in that part of Spain. And then after the expulsion of the Moors, it was Christianized, enlarged, sort of rounded off with this Renaissance topping, and then finished with a rotating statue of the Archangel Gabriel, or Michael rather. And Giralda means weather vane in Spanish. So White knew this, and he and Wells translated it into their own Renaissance idiom, aided by the fact that they were dealing with a steel framed building rather than a load bearing masonry building, so they could make it sort of taller and slenderer. And then he topped it not with the Archangel, but with a considerably more profane and completely undressed statue of Diana by his friend Augustus St. Gaudens. This is a statue that is the first public nude in America, and it amused many, it appalled some, and I think it is the kind of the signature work of American sculpture of the late 19th century. That whole tower topped Madison Square Garden. This building took up a huge amount of real estate, but it gave so much back. I mean, it gave everything back to the street. It changed New Yorkers' expectations of what to demand from their public architecture. I mean, now walking past this building was a pleasure. Looking at the building was a pleasure. Going into it was a pleasure. It had theaters. It had a arena for 12,000 people. It had a rooftop restaurant. The tower transformed the skyline of New York. I mean, it was Diana, when the lights were on, Diana could be seen as far away as Greenwich, Connecticut. And it transformed Stanford White as well. From this point, Stanford White became the most visible architect in New York, and commissions started coming in from all corners, including this corner. This is a man named Henry McCracken. McCracken was the chancellor of what was then called City University of New York, which very soon after that changed its name to New York University. And McCracken was running what was essentially a sort of a local and at best a regional liberal arts university, but his ambition was to create a great research university on the German model. But to do that, he needed more space. There just wasn't enough space to do it in Greenwich Village. And so he bought 40 acres up in the Bronx, and he hired Stanford White to come up with a master plan and then to design the academic buildings, of which the principal academic building was the library, now called the Gould Memorial Library. Well, McCracken had his office in that. These are the days when administrations in universities were very small, but the main point of this building was the library, the reading room in the center surrounded by a layer of books. And when you were designing a library of this nature, you had two sort of parties to choose from. You could do the Basilica plan, which is what McKim did up at the Boston Public Library, or you could do the Rotunda plan, which is what Stanford White is doing right here. And if you do the Rotunda plan, the next stop is to look at the granddaddy of all rotundas, the Pantheon in Rome. And it's interesting that many architects looked at the Pantheon, but they all would seem to sort of take some different lesson away from it. That, for example, McKim was designing the library for Columbia at exactly the same time that White was doing it for NYU. And what McKim saw in the Pantheon was essentially a wall, something that defined space by closing it off. And so when it came to the Low Memorial Library at Columbia, McKim got rid of the pediment. He increased the height of the attic. He added a couple of columns, and he created this great backstop for the open space of Columbia University. Stanford White looked at the Pantheon, I think, through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. He saw the Pantheon as a structure that had the potential in it of becoming this kind of Palladian institutional villa, and a building that sort of held its own in space by allowing space to surround it and then being a foreground element. And that's what he did for the Gould Memorial Library at what was then NYU, is now Bronx Community College. So he creates this Palladian urban villa. But White goes further than Thomas Jefferson ever would have gone, in that White sees the surfaces of the forms that he's created as opportunities for his interest in using ornament at a density that approaches the level of saturation. And that's what you see when you look at this building, that chenot and the pediment, the wonderful scalloped shells stamped out of copper that make the shingles on the dome. And then he relieves this density with passages of smooth marble or a lightly variegated Roman brick. So again, this is compression and release at a visual level. Compression and release is accomplished spatially as well in the interior. Here you come up the main stair going to the reading room, and the stair is a little narrower, a little taller, a little longer, a little steeper than you would like. And you get to the top of the stair and you're a little winded, but the doorway to the reading room is straight ahead. So you pull yourself together and go through that door, and this is what you go into. I mean, there is no person who has gone into this room for the first time, or even possibly for the 100th, has not stopped to take a few deep breaths, because this is Stanford White's idea of translating release into architectural terms. He also would interpret the Pantheon through other sort of idioms. This is the Pantheon as a Byzantine structure. This is the church, the Madison Square Presbyterian Church at 24th Street and Madison Avenue. And again, look at this sort of way he takes the ornament and he sort of saturates it to the point of beyond saturation. I mean, a bird could not find a place to hide in that cornice. And then he relieves it with these great passages of lightly variegated Roman brick and marble. He also looks at other countries. This is the Grand Trianon in Versailles, the building that was built for Louis XIV to entertain his mistresses. And White essentially sort of lifts the Grand Trianon. He takes the order of paired columns surrounding the arched windows, the ABA rhythm of solid, void, solid, the one-story height, the balustrade and general proportions, and he gives it to John Jacob Astor IV up in Rhinebeck, New York. This is called the Ferncliff Casino, and this is a building with a very strange program. You know, if you've read The House of Mirth, you remember that these house parties, particularly the ones up in the Hudson, were an important part of the kind of the courtship ritual in that period, the early 20th, late 19th century, that it allowed sort of eligible men to meet eligible women under highly controlled circumstances. And nothing was more controlled than the sleeping arrangements. And so this structure was created essentially as bedrooms for the male bachelor guests, about 500 yards away from the main house, to keep the girls safe. And but in addition to that, White also gave Astor some spaces that I think Louis XIV would have been jealous to have. Here is the main hall. This was had to be used as a ballroom for parties, a room you could take helicopter lessons in. But look at the kind of the etymology or the provenance of the ornamental details here. I mean, the plaster surround on that shallow dome looks like it was taken off a Luca della Robbia or a Botticelli. The columns have what are called French Ionic capitals with those wonderful outturned volutes and the tassels dangling down from them. The fireplace is this sort of muscular, massive, rather almost crude medieval element. And then the transoms over the doors say a lot more about the celebrated New England walking tour than they say about Versailles. With White, if it looked good and if it worked well together, he took it. I mean, in a sense, nothing was safe from Stanford White, and the results were always fantastic. That building has an indoor tennis court, which was done in collaboration with the Guastavinos. It's a very elegant piece of engineering. And then it has this swimming pool. This is the first or second indoor swimming pool in America. It's sort of a tie with Biltmore down in North Carolina. I have gone swimming in this pool, and you feel as if you have died and gone to heaven. It's just one color, really. It's blue, white, I suppose, is a color, and then light. And then the whole thing is animated with these porpoises that are emerging from the foliate leaves of the capitals. I mean, it's just the little touch that sort of sets the whole thing going. Well, Stanford White his designs did have a great deal of spirit, but this was not spirit for its own sake. It was spirit that was really quite targeted to reflect the spirit of the user of the building, the group that was going to use and enjoy the building. And I think an example of what I'm trying to say, this is sort of an extension of the architecture of empathy, is the facade of the Century Association on 43rd Street in New York, which White did with Wells. And here was a club where the members were artists, sculptors, painters, engravers, journalists, writers, poets, architects. And what White and Wells were trying to do was to create a facade that suggested that what went on inside the building sort of recapitulated the artistic fever of Florence in the 15th century. And 20 blocks to the south, he does something a little different. This is the entrance doors for the Players Club, which White did with Edwin Booth, converting Booth's townhouse into a club for actor members. And being an actor then as now was a highly precarious profession. And White creates these front doors that send a message, and the message is that on the other side of the front doors is a land of a world of sort of security and safety and serenity. And for an actor, that must have been a very welcome sight indeed. We'll back up town to the 59th Street or 60th Street and Fifth Avenue. This is the Metropolitan Club, the club that White designed for the merchant elite of the late 19th century. And so he gives them, and these were the bankers, lawyers, the shippers, the insurance people, the railroad, mostly railroad people, a lot of them. They were very, very rich, and they wanted a pretty fancy club. And so White creates this box, which is decorated with elements from the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. So he's off to a good start here on the outside. And then he gives it these entrance gates, which are like, you would expect to find gates like this at the beginning of Blenheim Palace, sort of followed by a 3-mile driveway and then Blenheim at the end of it. But instead, these gates just lead into a courtyard where members would arrive by carriage and be deposited and go in the front door. But in exchange for this sort of essentially a private act, sort of flauntingly private act of entrance, what White is doing is making this incredible gift to the streetscape. I mean, you and I walk along the street, we can enjoy these gates. We don't have to go in. It's this is Stanford White's idea of sort of generosity to the streetscape. This is honoring the street, and this building does it. Well, the members didn't have such a raw deal. They would go in through that triumphal arch there into the great marble hall, and then they would look at the details that Stanford White had sort of cooked up for their enjoyment, and they would feel as though their self-esteem had been appropriately recognized and properly satisfied. Well, Stanford White did love an arch. This is the Washington Memorial Arch down at Washington Square, and a structure that first was done as a paper mache and wood temporary structure for the parade that celebrated the 150th anniversary of George Washington's birth. But the design was so popular that money was raised. I mean, this included sort of pennies from school children to create the thing in stone, which it is, and it became the sort of starting or finishing point for these great parades that went up and down Fifth Avenue. So here is processional architecture, so recognized in architectural terms. Today we can't go through that in our open touring cars, which is a real shame because they've put these bollards up so you can walk through, but that's about it. The sculpture at the base was done by Alexander Calder's father, but the sculpture above that was done by a sculptor named Frederick McMonnies. And McMonnies was a friend of White's, and he was quite a good friend of Bessie's. He was invited out to Box Hill, the house in St. James, a lot. He shows up in the guest book, and I think that probably as one of the world's sort of greatest hostess presents, McMonnies went and carved Bessie into the left-hand spandrel of the Washington Memorial Arch. I mean, this is why it's important to invite good sculptors to your weekend house parties. Well, White did go to a lot of parties, Bessie not so much, but Stanford White, he would complain that he had to work all day and then dress up and do the party thing at night. Well, he was pretty serious about this. And he went to parties, I think, for two reasons. One was to keep an eye on his clients. That's Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish sitting in the right on that chair, but also to keep an eye on the competition. That is Francis Hoppin sitting on the ground there with a big smile on his face. Francis Hoppin was a protege of White's. He'd worked at McKim, Mead and White before he went off and opened his own office. He did the police headquarters with Hoppin and Cohn. I'm sure he'd done some houses in Newport, but White wanted to make sure that Francis Hoppin was not poaching on his client base. But White really did understand parties. He went to a lot of them. He knew parties. He knew what made parties work. You would ask Stanford White to design a party or a parade. I've always said that if you go to a party in a room designed by Stanford White, it's going to be more fun because the room is doing half the work. Well, the greatest of all party houses is the one right in Newport, that Rosecliff, the house he designed for Tessie Ulrichs, who was the heiress to the Comstock lode fortune, which was the largest amount of silver at that time ever pulled out of the ground. I don't know if it's ever been exceeded. But Tessie's goal was very simple. Her charge to Stanford White was to design a house that would allow her to give the best party in a single 60-day social season in Newport. I mean, you just had July and August, and she wanted to give the best one. And so Stanford White took the charge seriously, and I think he came up with a good solution here. The excitement of the party is based on, again, processional architecture. I mean, and the procession really starts when you're going down Bellevue Avenue, sort of clutching your invitation, but then you turn off and go down this driveway heading towards the front door, noticing two things. Noticing, first of all, that the front door is off center, which is not usual for the houses of that period. The front door was always in the center and they were symmetrical. But here it's off center and for a reason. The other thing you might notice was that the house is based on the Grand Trianon with an extra story because Tessie had a lot of house guests. So that your carriage would pull up in front of this front door. You might also notice the dragons that are supporting that little glass canopy over the front door. This is Stanford White is taking his taste for these bizarre animals well into his maturity. You go through the front door, you go into the vestibule, up a few steps through that triumphal arch. Again, what White is doing is he's creating, sort of controlling the mood through this sort of series of small tableau. And you arrive at the base of the staircase. And if you're a couple, the men would wait at the base, they'd hand off their coats, the women would go up the stairs to hand off their coats, take a last look in the mirror, straighten their dresses, and then they would descend down what I would have to say is the greatest staircase in America. And that cannot be an uncritical superlative, because it has to be. Name one better than this. This is processional architecture realized in stone, and you're having the best time at any party you've ever been to, and you haven't even gotten to the party yet. I mean, you have to go into another room to meet Tessie and say hello. You then go into another room to meet the rest of the guests. But this is really as good as it gets. Well, this house here, to back up, this house saw a few parties too. This is the Payne Whitney House in New York, 972 Fifth Avenue. It's now the Cultural Services of the French Embassy to the United States. So it's in good hands with the French. But it was built in 1902 for Payne and Helen Hay Whitney, right after their wedding. It was a wedding present from Payne Whitney's uncle, Oliver Payne, who essentially gave the young couple a blank check and told them to hire Stanford White and build himself a nice house. And Stanford White took that blank check extremely seriously, beginning with the fact that this house is 40 feet wide, is a whole exposed south elevation, and is made of solid granite, which is not an easy material to work with, and must have made sort of serious inroads into that blank check. The house has a couple of great rooms still there. It has this entrance hall, which is a wonderful sort of indoor-outdoor space. This is what you first come into, and it's a look at the treats that he has for you, these paired columns, remember, with this amazing marbling, the shallow dome, the fountain in the middle. I mean, these are all elements that make you think this is outdoors. The fountain in the middle was built up out of essentially odds and ends that Stanford White would accumulate on his travels to Rome from various antique dealers, including the statue on top, which is now recognized as a work of the very young Michelangelo. Hence the railing around it. It gets its sort of outdoor quality from the fact that it is this sort of circular space that you can go through. You go to a square space beyond it. And it also gets it from that shallow dome where the plaster relief is lattice that has vines growing in and out of it. It has these allegorical panels of love and fertility. Remember, this was a wedding present for a young married couple. And this whole thing is really based on what was an Italian Renaissance device for open air porches, where they'd have typically a vaulted ceiling. They would be open on 3 sides or 2 sides, but it would have the same bas relief, plaster painted, the same allegorical panels. This particular one is the Villa Papa Giulia, which is just at the edge of Rome within the walls. And this is where Pope Julius would go and retreat. This is before Castel Gandolfo as a place for popes to escape. But this is a relatively common Renaissance detail, and it is what White uses to create this transitional space. The house also has this room called the Venetian Room by Mrs. Whitney. And this, I would say, is Stanford White's single greatest design as a piece of interior architecture. This is where you would wait before you were admitted to see Mr. and Mrs. Whitney. And the waiting period in here must have been hallucinogenic. I mean, I talked about how White would create this fine detail that would be first revealed by and then dissolved by light. Well, here, this room is just dissolving all around you, and you're not even moving. The mirrors are separated by pieces of wood that replicate the frames around neoclassical pier mirrors. So the room also is this sort of ambiguity. I mean, is this a piece of furniture or is it a piece of architecture? I mean, it really occupies that estuarial middle ground between the two. The cove that surrounds the top is bronze lattice with these porcelain enamel roses growing in and out of it. I mean, very much like Rococo Bavarian candlesticks. And it's all based on, I understand, or inspired by that clock that Stanford White picked out and put on the mantelpiece. This room shows how Stanford White could step on the gas and still maintain a coherent design. But Stanford White could also step on the brake. This is the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument, a project that was one of the last designs of Stanford White. It was finished after his death for construction. And here the work was intended to memorialize the 3,000 colonial soldiers who died in prisoner of war ships in Wallabout Bay in Brooklyn during the Revolution, a really disgraceful incident in the war. And White is taking this memorial, which is a very sober and serious thing, and he's really with the language of silence. There is almost no ornament in this, with the exception of that urn at the top. And silence in this case is so powerful that it's a well worth a visit. Well, I'm going to end up with this image here. This is a picture taken in June of 1905 at Box Hill. As a picnic on the grass. You see Stanford White sitting on the blanket. Bessie's tugging his ear for some reason. Charles McKim is sitting on the blanket with a white hat with his back to the camera. And then Augustus St. Gaudens is sitting in the rocking chair. And then to the left are Jimmy and Frances Breeze, who were good friends of White and McKim's. And they were the clients for that house in Southampton that you saw at the beginning of this talk. But go back to the three, McKim, White, and St. Gaudens, that about 30 years earlier, these three, they were all redheads, incidentally, but as young men, they went down to the south of France to have a little bit of fun and to look at some architecture. And now they were at the absolute pinnacle of their professions. The St. Gaudens had been asked by Teddy Roosevelt to redesign the coinage for the United States Mint. Charles McKim had just accepted the gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects, the first American firm to be so honored. And Stanford White was the most visible architect in America. Well, a year after this picture was taken, the whole thing starts to come apart. Stanford White is murdered by a madman. St. Gaudens starts to lose his battle to cancer. You can see he looks slightly ailing in this picture. And then by 1909, Charles McKim dies at Box Hill, but I am convinced of a broken heart. And while there is this sort of melancholy footnote to this picture, I think when you take it at face value, it represents an extraordinary moment in the history of American arts. And it has been my pleasure to share it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was a great lecture. And we do have a few questions that have started coming in. So first question, did the firm create plans that could be purchased by the public?
I've been pushing a button. Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah. Did the firm create any plans that could be purchased by the public?
Well, you know, the short answer is they published their plans. They published in 1915, they started publishing these elephant folios of the great work of this period of McKim, Mead, and White. You buy a folio and you can see the plans. You can also go to for the most part, the New York Historical Society has the original drawings, and you can pay them and make copies of those drawings, and then good luck building these things. What I've always been sort of amazed by in these wonderful houses is how schematic the plans were, that there must have been an extraordinary amount of communication that was done in the field with the craftsmen who made these, because the plans, particularly the early shingle style houses, those plans are just their plan section elevation at 1/4 inch scale, and the rest of it must have been worked out in the field.
Excellent. So next question, how did White evolve from an ornamentalist into an architect designing a whole building?
Well, I think he started as an ornamentalist in his work with Richardson. When Richardson was designing the building, White was working on some of the details. So when you look at the interiors, such as the Senate for the New York State Senate up in Albany, which was done by Richardson, I think White is responsible for a lot of those details. But so he started as a detail man, and as I said, McKim and Mead really brought him in to do that. But White had seen that architects possibly have more fun than detail men, and so he decided that he wanted to design the building too. And so that house, Alden Villa in Cornwall, that's an example of Stanford White designing the building.
Excellent. There's a lot of questions coming in now. Let's see. How was the relationship between Stanford White and Richard Morse Hunt? Collegial, adversarial?
I think they loved each other. I mean, White and Richardson and McKim would, McKim worked for Richardson for 2 years after he came back from the Beaux-Arts. And when he left in 1872, White showed up and took over McKim's spot as the chief draftsman. McKim had been responsible for helping Richardson with the competition drawings for Trinity Church in Boston, while White was responsible for helping Richardson actually build Trinity Church, and I think is considered to have contributed to the design of the dome. They loved each other, and Richardson would, these famous stories of Richardson sort of being visited by White and McKim and announcing that he just, to celebrate this, he had to open a bottle of champagne in spite of the fact that it was against his doctor's orders. Well, apparently Richardson said that every night, but they were good friends even after they left. In fact, I have a theory that Richardson didn't really become Richardson until he had White and McKim out of his hair. I mean, when you have people that talented working for you, you'll find that the work that comes out of the office reflects to a great extent what they want rather than what you want. And so Richardson gets rid of White and McKim in the friendliest terms, and then Richardson gets to do what he wants. If you look at all the really great Richardson, or characteristic Richardson buildings, they all occurred after White and McKim had left.
Excellent. Next question. When you say St. Gaudens carved the stone bas-relief elements of the zodiac clock and the Wells gravestone, do you mean he carved the actual stone, or did he carve plaster and have stone carvers copy carvings on the stone as 18th and earlier 19th century sculptors did in their European studios?
Probably the latter in that case. I mean, I think that St. Gaudens started as a miniaturist, so he could carve stone. But in those days, he would make it in plaster. And then there was this wonderful supply of very, very skilled craftsmen available in America. This was when people were leaving from woodworkers from Germany, stone carvers and masons from Italy. And they were all coming to the United States because they felt this was the land of opportunity. And one of their opportunities was to work for Stanford White and Charles McKim.
Where did the idea of decorated stucco with glass fragments, etc., used in some of his gables and shingle houses come from?
I think that is something that he had seen in northwestern France. I think it is a medieval element, and I've never made a trip to drive around to look at the medieval architecture in that region of that period. Always having too much fun in Paris, and so. But I think that if I were to do that, I would see some examples of that. And I think that's where he saw it.
Excellent. With the complexity and size of these houses, how many draftsmen were needed to do all of the needed drawings manually before CAD?
There's a book, about the practice of architecture in this period that probably would be able to answer that question better than me. At their top, they had 100 draftsmen and in the firm, architects and draftsmen, and they may have been dealing with, 10 to 20 commissions at one time. So, it sounds like it could be 4 or 5. I mean, I think that you needed a lot of draftsmen because you had to draw everything and you had to draw it many, many times. But I would be very surprised if any one project had more than 10 people working on it.
Where did White study architecture?
At the school of Henry Hobson Richardson. Richardson was, you think of Richardson as a Boston architect, but Richardson started off, lived in Staten Island and had his office down on Hanover Square. And he moved up to Boston after he won the competition for the Trinity Church. White did move up with him, and Richardson became a Boston architect at that point, but that's where White learned. Everything he learned was at the knees of Richardson.
Can you tell us anything about White's death and how old he was when he died?
White was 53 when he was shot, and I think that he was murdered by Harry K. Thaw. And there are many things that, many books and that go into that in detail. Just one of them is a movie called The Girl on the Red Velvet Swing, which while it bears very little resemblance to truth, is a sweet movie, and you could probably start there.
And there are a number of variations on this question. If there are any architectural tours of White's work in New York City you know of.
I'm thinking. The short answer is I haven't seen a pure Stanford White walking tour. There are probably some people who give lectures on Stanford White's work in New York, but a walking tour doesn't. You could see 3 or 4 things walking, but then at that point you'd have to get in a little bus. You have to go up to the Bronx to see the Gould Memorial Library. I mean, that's a must see.
Excellent. So you somewhat answered this later on after this question was posted, but at the time of Stanford White's death, did he leave any unfinished buildings or architectural plans? And if so, what were they?
Well, the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument was under construction. I think they were still finishing up some portions of the Whitney House, but the one that I am most familiar with as an unfinished project is a church called Trinity Roslyn, which is a church in Roslyn, Long Island, that he was doing for Catherine Dorr Mackey. He did Harbor Hill for her, and she was a pretty nasty piece of work, I'd have to say. And there is this, so White is doing this church for her, this beautiful little country church. And after White's death, there is this letter that she wrote to Charles McKim, in which she is basically scolding McKim for some shortcomings on the job. And you read this letter and you think, how could this woman do this to this man? I mean, this guy, his best friend has just been killed, and this woman is, breaking his chops. It's an amazing letter for, it's just as fresh as paint for a kind of what it's like to work for a very difficult client.
Was there any work that he did in Chicago that you know of?
Yes, he did. Yes, the World's Fair, the 1893 Columbian Centennial Exposition. McKim was really the architect for the Agriculture Hall, the very, very big hall that was right on the Court of Honor. But Stanford White did he did the White Star Pavilion. He did the New York State Pavilion, which is based on the Villa Medici. And he did, I think, one other project there. So those buildings, unfortunately, don't exist. There's a house that he did for Joseph Patterson, the owner of the newspaper in Chicago, that's still there. And then he did the setting for St. Gaudens's Standing Lincoln, wonderful, huge scale exedra, curved bench that frames this statue of the pensive Abraham Lincoln.
Awesome. Do you know if White did any of the interior work for St. Paul the Apostle Church at 59th and Columbus Ave in New York City?
Somebody's throwing me a lob here. Yes, he did the the structure that encloses the altar. And I mean, that church is a real barn, I mean, huge, huge church. And they hired Stanford White to try to give the thing a little bit of focus around the altar for the sacrament. And so he creates this sort of Byzantine shell with gold mosaics and wonderful marbles. And it is this, it's like a light fixture in the middle of this great barn of a church. Wonderful thing.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm scrolling through to find the one I was just at. Okay, I can't find this one now. Sorry, there's a lot of questions to scroll through. Do you have a favorite design by Stanford White?
Well, I have, I'd say, 3 favorites. My favorite residential design would be the Venetian room at the Whitney House. Just a brilliant design. My favorite institutional design would be the Gould Memorial Library, which is just a miracle that that is still there. It's an interior and exterior landmark at state, city, and national level. And then my favorite monument is really the Washington Memorial Arch, a structure that I would say is one of the, if you were to name 5 structures that were essential to New York, I'd name 2 bridges, 2 skyscrapers, and the Washington Memorial Arch. And the rest you can pick what you want for the rest, but those are the 5 that I'm taking with me.
Excellent. And then we have ask one last question. Is there a publication or reference materials detailing the New England walking tour?
It is mentioned in Leland Roth's book from the early, I think 1980, called The Architecture of McKim, Mead, and White. Leland Roth was the scholar of McKim, Mead, and White. I mean, everybody who does anything on McKim, Mead, and White is standing on the shoulders of Roth, who produced this work first as a dissertation for his PhD at Yale under Vincent Scully. And so I would say that the most authentic or reliable account of that tour is in Roth. But still, in terms of what they saw, specific buildings, I've never seen letters or anything that gave a kind of a point by point, this is what they saw.
Excellent. Okay, so that was the last question. I actually have one last one that I think is an interesting question, asking after his death, if it was a grand funeral for a fallen hero or more of a private family service.
Well, when he died, no, it was very private. It was in St. James, Long Island, and if you know, the press really went to town after Stanford White was murdered, and it was an example of sort of the first time they had essentially put the victim on trial, and so this was not a good situation. Bessie and Stanford White's son Larry left to go to France because it was just horrible, but the funeral service was very private at the small Upjohn Episcopal Church in St. James.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam. It was a fantastic lecture. Lots of great questions. So thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question for you. What's the painting behind you?
It is View of a Lily Pond by Louis-Jules Dumoulin.
Very nice. Excellent.
Thank you so much. And
Okay.
thank you
Thank you
everyone.
very
Have a
much.
great
Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.